Mike spent 5 years telling Cora that as an orphan, she was a ghost no one would ever look for until she sat beside a man who looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered in a city he already owned. The subway train rattled through the dark tunnel. Cora huddled into her red knitted sweater, her fingers white-knuckled around her red handbag. She sat on the far left side of the seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. The reflection in the subway glass showed a woman she barely recognized, bruised, bleeding, and broken. A dark purple bruise bloomed around her left eye, and thin cuts from Mike's ring jagged across her forehead. She looked at the other passengers. They were ordinary people going home. Some looked at her with pity, but most turned their heads away. This was the orphan complex Mike had built for her. He had convinced her that because she had no family, no one would ever step in to help her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every time the train slowed down, she expected Mike to burst through the doors. She could still feel the heat of his rage and the way he had hissed that she was nothing without him. She was a slim, petite woman with natural curly hair that was now damp from the rain and messy from the struggle. Her oval face was pale and her large expressive eyes were wide with a hypervigilance that had become her only way of surviving. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get as far away from Mike Hudson as possible. She felt like a hollow shell of a person, running on nothing but pure adrenaline and the desperate hope that she could finally disappear. The carriage was mostly quiet, filled with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clacking of the metal tracks. Cora stared straight ahead, her lips slightly parted as she tried to catch her breath. She was a runaway, a victim of a 5-year war she was finally trying to end. She just needed one moment of peace, one place where Mike couldn't reach her. But deep down, she feared that he was already right behind her. The air in the subway train suddenly shifted. It grew heavy with a cold, controlled pressure that made the hair on the back of Cora's neck stand up. A subtle scent of expensive cedar and something sharper, like the smell of cold metal, drifted over her. Cora finally forced herself to glance sideways, and her breath caught in her throat. Sitting directly beside her was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of stone. Jim Lee was a young man with sharp East Asian features and a well-defined jawline. He was dressed in a blue tailored suit that cost more than everything Cora had ever owned. His white shirt was crisp and a luxury silver wristwatch gleamed on his arm. Unlike the other passengers, he wasn't looking away. He was leaning forward, his legs slightly spread, taking up space with a quiet dominance that was far more terrifying than Mike's loud screaming. Small, intricate dragon tattoos snaked up his neck and disappeared into his swept-back black hair. His hands resting on his knees also bore dark ink designs. Cora realized with a jolt of terror that she had sat beside a man who lived in a world of violence. Jim Lee's eyes were narrow and focused, tracking the movement of the train with a calm intensity. He didn't look surprised by Cora's injuries. Instead, he looked at her with a clinical gaze as if he were assessing a puzzle. He didn't offer a smile or a soft word. He simply sat there, a pillar of unnatural stillness in the moving train. Cora's hands gripped her red handbag even tighter. She felt like she was caught between two fires: the monster she was running from and the enigma she had just met. Jim Lee was a man of high status and discipline, and his presence created a vacuum of power in the carriage. Even the background passengers seemed to sense it. They grew quieter, their eyes darting toward the tattooed man in the expensive suit. Cora felt her pulse thrumming in her teeth. She wanted to move to run to another train, but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped by the sheer weight of his presence. The train screeched to a halt at an obscure transfer point. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed like a scream through the nearly empty train. Cora looked out the window and her heart stopped. Under the aggressive glare of the platform lights, she saw a silhouette she knew too well. Mike Hudson was leaning against a train. His face contorted with a familiar jagged rage. He hadn't just tracked her. He had predicted her. He was waiting like a predator at a watering hole. Beside Cora, Jim Lee remained perfectly still. He didn't rush to stand. He didn't even look toward the window. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward Cora. "He's here." Cora choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Her knuckles were white with a grip born of pure terror. Mike saw her through the glass and his smile widened. A predatory, ugly thing. He began to stride toward the doors, his heavy boots thumping on the concrete. Jim Lee tilted his head, revealing the dark ink on his neck. Men who believe they own things rarely let them go without a trail, he said. His voice was a low melodic hum that vibrated through the air. The doors hissed open, inviting the freezing night air into the train. Cora stood on unsteady legs, her slim frame swaying. She looked at the exit, and then back at the man in the blue suit. "If you walk out there alone," Jim Lee said, his tone a cold warning, "you are going back to that cage. And this time, he will ensure the door never opens again." Jim Lee rose then, his tall, athletic frame unfolding with a grace that made the cramped train feel even smaller. He didn't wait for her permission. He simply stepped into the aisle, creating a path. As they stepped onto the platform, the rain drenched Cora instantly. Mike pushed forward, intent on grabbing her arm, but he never reached her. Jim Lee stepped into the gap. He didn't raise his hands or shout. He simply stood there, one hand casually resting near his face. Mike skidded to a halt, his bravado hitting a wall of ice. He looked up at Jim Lee, and for the first time in 5 years, it was Mike who was afraid. The silence on the platform was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic patter of the rain. Mike Hudson tried to puff out his chest, but against Jim's relaxed but dominant posture. He looked small and weak. "That's my wife," Mike spat, though his voice lacked its usual venom. "I'm taking her home." Jim Lee exhaled a thin stream of smoke from a cigarette he had just lit, his expression emotionally unreadable. He looked at his luxury silver wristwatch as if he were bored by the encounter. "She doesn't look like she wants to go with you," Jim Lee remarked. The smoothness of his tone was more terrifying than a scream, and I find I have a very low tolerance for people who touch things that don't belong to them. Mike barked back, trying to reassert his power. "She's an orphan. She has nobody. You hear me? Nobody is coming for her." Jim Lee's eyes narrowed into a lethal, focused stare. He took a single step forward and the sheer weight of his dangerous energy forced Mike to take an involuntary step back. "You are mistaken," Jim Lee whispered. "She is standing beside me. That means she is no longer alone. And if you take one more step toward her, I will ensure you never take another step again." Mike looked at the dragon tattoos on Jim Lee's hands and the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. He realized he was dealing with a power that could erase him from the world in a heartbeat. Without another word, Mike turned and fled toward his car. The tires screeched as he disappeared into the darkness. Cora stood shivering, her survival energy finally beginning to crack. She looked up at the man who had just saved her, her large brown eyes filled with a new kind of uncertainty. "Why?" she whispered. Jim Lee looked down at her, his gaze momentarily softening. He gestured toward a sleek black car that had just pulled up to the curb. "Because," he said. "Simply, I want to see what you become when you finally stop running." He led her to the car, and Cora realized she was leaving the world she knew for a fortress of iron and ink. The car ride was a blur of neon lights and silence. Cora sat in the back of the sleek sedan, her slim, petite frame practically swallowed by the leather seats. Beside her, Jim Lee remained a statue of cool indifference. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a house, but at the base of a soaring glass monolith that seemed to pierce the storm clouds. This was the Dragon's Den, the nerve center of Jim Lee's empire. A security team in sharp dark suits moved with military precision to open the doors. Cora followed Jim Lee into a private elevator. The doors slid open at the summit, revealing a sprawling penthouse made of charcoal-colored furniture and polished concrete. The space was cavernous and surgically clean. Cora stood frozen in the foyer, her wet sneakers leaving damp prints on the pristine floor. She had expected a sanctuary, but this place felt like a command center. Men stood in the shadows of the hallways, quiet, alert figures with the same focused eyes as Jim Lee. "This isn't a house," Erito whispered. Jim Lee shed his tailored suit jacket, handing it to a subordinate. He stood in his white dress shirt, the top buttons open to reveal his ink. "It is the seat of governance," he replied. He walked toward a bar made of raw stone and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He offered one to Cora, his posture relaxed but commanding. "You wanted to run from a man who used your isolation to break you. To do that, you had to enter a world where isolation is a luxury we cannot afford. Cora took the glass with trembling fingers. She looked at his hands and saw the history of violence written in the tattoos on his knuckles. She realized then that she hadn't just escaped a toxic husband. She had been pulled into the heart of the Korean Mafia. These men weren't just security. They were soldiers. Mike had always told her she was nothing because she had no family. Now she was in the most dangerous home in the city, guarded by a man who saw her vulnerability as a project rather than a target. It was terrifying. But for the first time, she felt a spark of potential. The guest suite was a silent expanse of high-end finishes and oppressive luxury. Cora stood in the center of the room, her reflection showing in the dark, polished surface of a dresser. A woman in a professional uniform had left a tray of medical supplies and silk pajamas on the bed. Cora was alone with the hum of the climate control. With a hand that still shook, she reached up to touch the red knitted sweater she had worn as armor. She entered the marble bathroom, a temple of white stone and soft light. She stopped before the floor-to-ceiling mirror. For a long moment, she couldn't look. In her mind, she was still the hollow shell Mike had spent 5 years hollowing out. When she finally lifted her gaze, the reality of her swollen face hit her like a physical blow. Her oval face was a map of Mike's final lessons. A dark purple bruise bloomed around her temple, and the swelling on her cheek made her eyes look sunken and haunted. "You have nobody, Cora." Mike's voice echoed in the silence. He had spent years making her believe her lack of family made her invisible. But as she stared at her reflection, she saw something else. There was a quiet survival energy that Mike had never been able to fully extinguish. She looked at her warm, light brown complexion and felt a strange heat in her chest. For the first time, she didn't just see a victim. She saw a survivor. She began to clean her wounds, her fingers moving with a clinical focus. She thought of Jim Lee. He was a man of cold, controlled intensity. Mike was a small bully who hid behind a marriage license. Jim Lee was a powerful force who sat at the center of a dragon's den. Mike had been wrong. Being an orphan didn't mean she was alone. It meant she was free to build a new foundation. She shed the red sweater and the denim jeans, letting the clothes of her old life fall to the floor. She stepped into the hot shower, letting the water wash away the grime and the memory of Mike's touch. When she dressed in the silk pajamas, she felt like a different person. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the door. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She felt like a storm in the making. The next morning, the penthouse was filled with a sharp clinical gray light. Cora emerged from her suite, her slim frame feeling fragile against the concrete foyer. She had traded the silk for a soft blue sweater and jeans she found in the wardrobe. Her face still bore the marks of her past, but her large eyes were now filled with a flickering curiosity. She found Jim Lee in a glass-walled gym overlooking the city. He wasn't training with the uncontrolled violence Mike used. Instead, his athletic frame moved with slow, deliberate strikes against a heavy bag. He wore a black sleeveless shirt, leaving his intricate dragon tattoos fully visible. Cora stood at the threshold, watching his precision. Jim Lee stopped and turned to face her with a calm but intense gaze. "You look at the fist, Cora, because that is what Mike taught you to fear," he said. His voice carried across the quiet room. "But the fist is only a tool. True power begins in the mind." Cora stepped further into the room. Mike said power was about who could hurt who the most. He said, "I was nothing because I didn't have the strength to fight back." Jim Lee's narrow eyes hardened with disdain for Mike. He gestured for her to stand by the window. "Mike used your orphan complex to make you feel invisible. But look at this city." Cora looked out at the sprawling grid below. "It's huge. I'm just a speck." Jim Lee stood behind her. His presence powerful but not crowding her. "Exactly. To a small man like Mike size is everything. But to me being a speck means you are untraceable. You are a ghost. And a ghost cannot be struck." He leaned in slightly, the scent of cedar drifting around her. "Presence is not about being the loudest. It is about the absolute certainty that you belong in the space you occupy. It is about a mask that denies your enemy the satisfaction of seeing your fear." For the next hour, he didn't teach her how to fight. He taught her how to stand. He corrected her posture, telling her to pull her shoulders back. He made her practice walking with fluid grace. "Your eyes are your weapon," he whispered. "Mike wants to see the haunted eyes of a victim. Give him nothing. Look through him." Cora felt her shame transform into something sharper. She was learning that her isolation wasn't a hole to fall into. It was a fortress to build. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the penthouse, Cora sat on the sofa, tracing her lips, which were finally starting to heal. She watched Jim Lee as he stared out at the city he governed. The silence between them was a controlled quiet that invited her to speak. "Why me, Jim Lee?" she finally asked. "Why go to this length for an orphan who has nothing to offer you?" Jim Lee turned slowly, his focused eyes meeting hers. He reached for a cigarette, his relaxed posture never wavering. "Being an orphan is not a lack of value," he said. "It is a specific kind of shield. When you have no one, you have no choice but to become your own foundation. I protect you because I know how heavy that foundation feels." He walked closer. "I didn't always sit at the top of this building. I grew up in the shadow of men who looked exactly like Mike. Men who believed power was something you took from the weak." He looked at the tattoos on his wrists. "I was 10 when I realized the only way to stop a monster was to become a god. I had no family to protect me. I had to build my own armor piece by piece." Cora felt a tightening in her chest. She realized that this powerful man's presence was born of the same hollow shell existence she was fleeing for 5 years. She whispered, "Mike used my silence against me. He knew I had no parents or siblings to call. He told me the world would swallow me whole because I didn't exist to anyone else." She touched the bruise on her temple. "He didn't just hit me. He tried to erase me." Jim Lee went very still. "He used your isolation to build a cage," he stated, "but isolation is only a cage if you believe the walls are there to keep you in. To me, they are there to keep the rest of the world out." Cora looked up at him. "He's still out there. He thinks he owns me." Jim stood directly in front of her. "Ownership is an illusion for small men. Mike thinks he is hunting a lost girl. He doesn't realize he's trying to reclaim a woman who has been claimed by the Dragon's Den. You are the orphan shield now, Cora. You don't need a family to be strong. You need to realize that you are the only person who can truly set yourself free." Cora's posture began to settle. She saw the dragon tattoos and didn't see a criminal. She saw a man who had written his own history. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady. "I know," Jim Lee murmured. "And soon Mike will know it too." The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted as the sun went down. It was no longer a quiet sanctuary. It was a war room. While Cora practiced the disciplined strength Jim Lee had taught her, the world outside was beginning to fracture. Mike Hudson, stripped of the property he used to define his life, had become a different kind of shell, one fueled by toxic desperation. He was no longer the smug predator. He was a man losing his grip on power. His bravado had crumbled the moment he realized Cora was no longer invisible. In his mind, her survival was a personal insult. To find her, he needed a key to a world that usually chewed men like him up. In the dark corners of the city's industrial district, Mike began a dangerous dance with the rival syndicate. He met them in a basement that smelled of stale adrenaline and smoke. His face was a mask of unreadable malice. Mike didn't just offer information on Cora. He began selling out the foundations of his own life. He traded confidential police files and the locations of safe houses just for a single lead on Cora's new family. He was gambling everything, convinced that the only way to reclaim her was to burn down the fortress she had found. Back in the penthouse, Jim Lee stood at his obsidian desk, tracking data across several screens. His lethal glint was back in his eyes. He didn't hide the reality from Cora. He treated her as a partner in this governance. "Mike is making moves." Jim Lee said he has joined forces with people who want to pierce this den. He is using his knowledge of the city to guide them. Cora stood tall, her broad shoulders back. "He thinks he can win because he knows where I came from." Jim Lee looked at her. "He knows who you were. He has no idea who you are now." A group of armed men suddenly appeared on the security monitors moving toward the base of the building. The rival syndicate was here, guided by Mike's desperation. Jim Lee didn't look worried. He checked his luxury silver watch. "It seems your husband wants a final lesson," he said. Cora didn't flinch. She felt the iron in her blood. She wasn't the woman in the red sweater anymore. She was a ghost who had finally found her haunt. The elevator doors at the summit of the Dragon's Den hissed open. But it wasn't a team of soldiers who stepped out first. It was Mike Hudson. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic sort of triumph. Behind him stood the armed men of the rival syndicate, their weapons leveled at the shadows. Mike scanned the room until his eyes landed on Cora. She was standing in the center of the foyer. Her posture relaxed, but controlled exactly as Jim Lee had taught her. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't clutching a handbag. Her oval face was a mask of absolute stillness. "Cora," Mike breathed, his voice a mixture of relief and rage. "Get over here. I've made a deal. You're coming home." Cora didn't move. She didn't even blink. "I am home, Mike," she said. Her voice was steady, a resonant hum that carried across the room. Mike laughed a harsh, jagged sound. "This place, these people, they don't care about you. You're an orphan. You're nothing to them." Jim Lee stepped out of the shadows, his blue suit jacket open, his dragon tattoos pulsing in the dim light. He didn't look at Mike. He looked at the gunman with a subtle wave of his hand. The shadows around the room came to life. Jim Lee's own soldiers appeared, their presence creating a vacuum of power that made the rival gang hesitate. "The deal is over," Jim Lee said. The smoothness of his tone made Mike freeze. Cora took a step forward, her expressive eyes focused and lethal. She looked through Mike as if he were a minor inconvenience. "You spent 5 years telling me that the world would swallow me if I left you," she said, "but look around, Mike. The world didn't swallow me. It welcomed me." She stood face to face with the man who had broken her for half a decade. Mike reached out to grab her, but he stopped. When he saw the look in her eyes, it was the same calm, intimidating stare that Jim Lee possessed. He realized then that he couldn't hurt her anymore. He didn't have the power to make her feel small. Jim Lee's men moved in, disarming the rival gang with military precision. Mike was left standing alone, a hollow shell in a room full of gods. "Take him away," Jim Lee commanded. As Mike was dragged toward the elevator, screaming that she had nobody, Cora turned to Jim Lee. She wasn't a victim or a student anymore. She was the architect of her own sanctuary. The orphan Mike had tried to bury was gone, and in her place stood a woman who ruled the city beside the dragon. The moral lesson from this story is that true power is not found in those who use fear to control others, but in the strength to reclaim your own narrative. When you stop seeing your isolation as a weakness and start viewing it as a foundation, you become unshakable. Your past does not define your future potential.